This time last year, in a unanimous landmark ruling, the Supreme Court struck down Canada's ban on physician-assisted suicide. The top court ruled that those with severe and irremediable suffering, be it physical or psychological, have a right to doctor-assisted suicide and euthanasia. This week, in a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court granted Justin Trudeau's federal government a 4-month extension to pass related legislation, rather than the 6 months the government was asking for. So much for parliamentary supremacy. The activist court also ruled that Quebec's doctor-assisted death, which prematurely came into effect in December, can remain in effect. That same day, it was confirmed that a Quebec City patient was killed with the assistance of a doctor, marking Canada's first life to be cut short by our new reality as a nation which gives its publicly funded doctors a license to kill. Joining me now is freelance journalist, former editor and reporter at the National Post, anti-euthanasia activist, and my friend Charles Lewis. Charles, so good to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off with the news from this week. 4-month extension. Is that enough to do anything when it comes to safeguards from the perspective of the Liberal government?
No, it's not at all. I mean, one of the things I think your viewers should understand right away, that we have yet, since the Supreme Court decision in February 2015, was unanimous, as you said, have not had a debate in this country. Not one debate during the election, and I think this was a failure of the candidates, but also a failure of journalists. This never came up. Now, if it did, and I missed it somehow, I'm sorry, but I've been monitoring this thing like crazy for the last 2 years, and how could this not come up as a debate? So we haven't had a debate. This is representing a complete change in our culture, where we're now going to think of killing patients as a medical option. I think that's important. It's not something, it'll very soon won't be something extraordinary from the example of other countries. And I don't understand how 4 months is enough, especially given the agenda the Liberals have set out for themselves.
Now, and I want to say that we did debate in the House of Commons before the Supreme Court ruling back in 2010, and it was shut down by over 200 votes. Now, with respect to the lack of debate, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, at least in this province of Ontario, will say, no, we had a consultation, and yet we're seeing news that they determined things before that consultation even took place, including the fact that physicians who refuse to kill patients or help them commit suicide must find an effective referral. Talk to me a little bit about how you see, because I imagine, despite the patchwork of where we are right now, this might be part of the Liberal government's legislation going forward. Tell us about what effective referral is and what you see as being good or bad about it.
Okay. As I understand it, the issues about referrals will still be left to the provinces who control healthcare. I hate to use that term in regards to euthanasia, but unfortunately that's it. Also, the colleges, they basically call the shots. Now, the issue about nobody can make somebody do a procedure, and I should make it clear, we're not just talking about euthanasia, what the college is doing. It's also things like abortion.
Right.
Okay, so you can't make somebody do it, but a lot of doctors, and not the majority obviously, say, because of my conscience or because of my religion, I'm not referring somebody. I'm not going to abet this, as they see it, as a crime. So I use the example of, if your friends are robbing a bank, okay, I'm not out there robbing the bank, but I'm in the getaway car helping them get away. And they call it cooperation with evil. And I completely agree, that's exactly what it is. It's cooperation with evil. So to make somebody refer, you are now deciding that their conscience is less important than the patient's needs. Now, personally, for me, I want a doctor who follows their conscience, all right? Otherwise, how do I trust that person?
Right.
And so this is not just, even if it's just talking about a few cases, it's fundamental to where we're going as a society. Not only are we going to kill people, but we're going to make people take part in it, even if it's not directly. To me, if I say, I won't shoot you, but you have a gun, and I said, don't worry, Faith will shoot you, that doesn't absolve me.
Exactly, it's like a contract killer, and we're seeing already in other jurisdictions where it's been legal, Dutch doctors being sued for not providing effective referrals. I want to stick on the topic of the colleges of physicians and surgeons. Alberta now saying that there should be no age limit to those who are eligible for euthanasia-assisted suicide. Where do you stand on that?
Okay. remember that this comes out of this external report for the Supreme Court case that the government ordered. However, what changed was initially they were going to make firm recommendations. I read a good part of the report yesterday. It just came out. So what it is, it's essentially a suggestions. We heard this, we heard that. So what some people are saying is we should give the right to what they call minor adults to have the right to decide.
Minor adult, that sounds so bizarre. I'm sure for a lot of folks. Are you a minor or are you an adult?
12 to the age of whatever majority is in that place. Could be 19, 21. Now, whether they'll do that right away, I think it's clear that somebody that young making a decision to kill themselves is horrific enough on its own. But even if they were not to approve that in Holland and Belgium, it eventually evolved to that.
Right.
Now, it's important, I can't emphasize this enough for people to understand that this is not just about people who are writhing in agony and dying and have basically 3 days to go, so somebody says, what's the point? And that's not really what the majority of these cases end up being. What they end up being is people with chronic pain, people with mental issues, and people with deadly diseases. I mean, I can go on and on about what the problem with all those are. And in Holland and Belgium now, you can have chronic pain, and the doctor says, well, we could give you help. And you can say, I don't want the help, I just want to die. And they're obligated to kill you.
Right.
And it's important also that people understand, and this is extremely interesting. In this report, a woman Professor Jocelyn Downey, who was pro-euthanasia, makes the point, unfortunately she's right, that the Supreme Court decision doesn't put limits on anything. It's a floor, right? The sky's the limit. Parliament can do whatever they want. They can go as far as they want. And so that means there is, when people talk about this, this dangerous slope we can be on, it's already built into the system.
It's built into our system, and it's already unfolded in every single jurisdiction where we've seen assisted suicide and euthanasia come to pass. It always ends up moving to permissions for the mentally ill, although ours already essentially has it built in. Then children, we're already talking about that before, de jure it is legalized, say perhaps the jurisdiction of Quebec. And from there we see then abuses where doctors are not waiting for permission, they're not asking for permission, and then we even see, in Belgium, say nurses performing it when they're not supposed to have that right.
Yeah, and the danger is in those situations is, of course, they started out more conservative, and they become what they are today, which is a killing machine. Thousands of people are being killed, 6,000 last year in Holland alone. Belgium, everybody knows, including the New England Journal of Medicine, that they underreport grossly. Because this notion of being killed to deal with mental suffering, other forms of suffering, the fact that somebody ends up doing it, let's say without permission, it becomes like jaywalking, right? Okay, you shouldn't have done that, but it's not actually a big deal, because eventually, and this happened in one case, they said, well, she was probably going to ask for death anyway. So if you did it a little bit prematurely, so what?
That is terrifying, especially in a system where our doctors are government agents, right? How can we give them the right? And actually, I want to follow up on that, because a lot of our viewers out there, we've got social conservatives who are largely going to be with you, but then we've got libertarians who are going to say, you know what? It should be my right to end my life. If I'm not liking where I'm at, it's my suffering. It should be my decision what to do with my life. How do you respond to them?
Well, they already can kill themselves. People commit suicide all the time. I think it's tragic, but people do it. Nobody can stop you, okay? So for the libertarians out there, I would say you're still free to do it. It's not against the law. Even if you fail in your attempt, and if you are successful, it's clear they're not going to prosecute you after. But what I would say to libertarians is, and I used to say this to some of the editorial board members of the National Post, who are quite libertarian, you don't trust the government to pick up garbage. We always want to go for private people, fair enough. We don't trust the government to do many things, and now you're trusting them to do this? Of all the things in the world to trust them with, in fact, the argument to me against the death penalty, I also think killing is immoral, but putting that aside, and obviously seeing that, there are some people who probably deserve to die, they make mistakes. there's no coming back from it. I mean, you read the Innocence Project in the U.S., this is a very similar situation. It's a decision to take your life, now for a different reason, but if you make a mistake, well, that's a hell of a big mistake.
And I'm happy that you actually bring up the death penalty, because folks at home are likely aware of these botched killings that have happened when it comes to carrying out the death penalty south of the 49th. Now, this week, in an issue of the National Post, we saw a column out quoting anesthesiologists who said there are things like awakenings and botched killings when it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide. So this idea of being put out of your misery, put out of suffering, might not necessarily end in this case. Am I right?
Yes, that's true. And I think that's another indication of we're going into the unknown with little preparation. So going back to your first question, is 4 months enough? I think most reasonable people can think, since we've not debated this, certainly I take your point about 2010, but a lot has changed in the last 6 years. A lot has changed. So it shows that. And just if I can just say something about that, the change. I started writing about this issue in 2007, on and off. I wasn't as obsessed as I was as I am now. And I remember people saying to me, it's an interesting issue, but why are we doing it? There's no chance of it happening here. There was one woman who eventually passed, Francine Lalonde, a PQ MP, who would bring it up like clockwork every year. She was a very nice woman, actually, and she thought this was the right way to go. But it was I wouldn't say a joke, but it was a non-starter for sure. Then suddenly, as Quebec began to create their own law, illegally, by the way, since the criminal code today still says it's illegal, so I noticed that more and more people that I knew were saying how much they were in favor of it. The polls, though they were always a strong indication of people in favor, suddenly hit 80%.
Right.
And I thought, what happened? I mean, this question comes up in every talk I've done, and I've done plenty of them, and I don't really know the answer. It's as if something snapped in people's heads. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people see this as a religious issue. People are becoming less religious, and so they resent the idea that religious groups may also oppose this, so they see themselves as being manipulated, which I think is complete nonsense. Because a religious group is against something doesn't mean you can't be against it also. It's like feeding the homeless. Churches do this all the time, but nobody says those bad churches. So it's very interesting, and it's frightening how fast it's changed. And not only that, it's a, if I could just tell this very quick story. The other night I was watching Bill Maher, the talk show host, the most obnoxious human being alive today, as far as concerned. I get a kick out of it too, but I cannot stand him. But anyway, he had the deputy governor of California on, and they were having a little tete-a-tete, a little love-in about what a great place California is to live in because of all the liberal things they've done. And they listed a number of things, and there was polite applause with each one. And then they hit, and now we've made assisted suicide legal, and the crowd went nuts.
Weird.
I mean, like...
Weird.
And I thought to myself, if this deputy governor or Bill Maher had any sense of decency, they would have said, even if you're in favor of it, look, this is nothing to applaud about. It's a tragedy. It's going to happen rarely or whatever. But no, they were both smiling. And I thought, what the hell are they smiling about? They're smiling about people being put to death and then their families having to live with the repercussions of that. That was truly a creepy moment for me.
And this is going to be my final question. When a society gleefully embraces the idea of creating almost a duty to die for its most vulnerable people in society, what does the future of that society look like?
Terrible. Terrible. I've said this a few times, and people got angry at me for bringing it up, but I often think of what happened in Germany under Nazism. The culture begins to believe that there are certain people. The German term was something like useless eaters. In other words, you're sucking the system dry. Now, I'm not saying that today we're heading into a Nazi state. I'm not that irresponsible. But we are heading into a position where we are going to teach people to stop caring about those who are vulnerable. All right. It's going to be very difficult because having had severe chronic pain with a spinal problem for 4 years, it's not only difficult for me, but it's difficult for the people around you, your spouse, my wife, and it can be very difficult. And depending on the relationship you're in, whether you even have people around you, this can be a very hard thing to go through. Now, if you don't mind, let me just, if I can tell this one quick story.
Please.
When I had this very bad spinal problem. The pain was beyond anything I ever thought I would experience, and it was unrelenting. It went on for, a couple of years, then surgery, and then more pain, and on and on. And I was at the point where I was really beside myself. I was gobbling morphine like it was going out of style, and I really started to wonder, what's going to happen? And of course, what did happen was I had to give up many of the things I've liked, going to the gym, biking, hiking, traveling, whatever it may be. But one night when I was taking stock of this, because insomnia also came with taking all this morphine, I realized that in my situation, this is not to brag, I was in relatively good shape. My wife works at the Globe and Mail. I had a fantastic insurance plan that I paid a lot of money for, but was kicking in. I was under no pressure from work. Our house is paid off. And basically, I had nothing to worry about other than getting well. That's rare, okay, these days. I'm sorry it is, but it is. So think of the person, and now we're in a euthanasia world, who can't take care of his family because he's sick. There's no insurance. He lives alone, perhaps, or she lives alone. You really don't have any help, and you're suffering terribly. And it becomes sort of pointless after a while. Like, what am I going through this for? What's the end game? I don't have money. I can't pay the rent. My family doesn't want to bother me. Unfortunately, these are typical situations. In today's society, what we should be doing is looking at how do we help those people.
Hear, hear.
Right. Instead, we're now coming up with this idea that maybe they should die. So this person may be compelled, and I think will be compelled, to say this is an option. And I've known people who've gotten grievously ill and have talked about suicide, but didn't, for the same reasons that any of us who've ever thought of it don't. It's frightening, what if I botch it, all that. But if suddenly there's a system that makes it easy for you, I think that's going to make a big difference to people. In Holland, for example, palliative care has actually been reduced as euthanasia becomes more popular. There's a signal right there of what's going to happen. Can I just finish with one little story, if you don't mind? Okay. This is the extreme, but I think this is exactly what we're going to be facing. In Holland, there was a family who had a 19-year-old daughter who was diagnosed with lupus. Now, if you can picture this, and please, anybody listening, try to picture this. Your own kid has lupus, and you sit around together and say, what are we going to do? And your daughter says, I want to kill myself. And the parents go, you know what, we think that's a good idea. You can avoid a lot of suffering, right? So they make an appointment to go to the doctor. They go to the doctor, and I think it was a female doctor, it doesn't really matter, but this woman said, you know what, I'm not doing this. There's no reason for this young woman to take her life. It's lupus. We can treat it. She can have a fulfilling life. And said, I'm not doing it. So this young woman was so freaked out, so upset, goes home and hangs herself in her backyard. Oh. The parents come home and see this, and instead of grieving the way normal people would, they blame this on the doctor because he refused to kill her. They're saying they caused her, the young woman, and them, the family, mental anguish. He's also in trouble with his, whatever the medical groups are there. So let's review this. This woman, the doctor, she tries to stop the daughter from being killed, which you would think was the normal reaction. Mm-hmm. The family had already agreed as a unit to have her die. The doctor refuses, and for refusing to kill their child, they're now suing him. There's other examples like this. Is this what we want? Is this where we want to go? And for people who say, why should it happen here? This is my comeback. I'll say it, I'm a Catholic, but doesn't have to be a Catholic issue. And some of my friends will often get on me for saying, well, you're unreasonable. All you do is you exist on faith. And that's true. And it's funny, in this situation, my fear of euthanasia, aside from the moral problem, is looking at what other countries have done.
That's it.
And seeing where it's gone.
You do
and
not.
So who's now operating on blind faith now? You're hoping that the country will come around. And just to make this last point, I promise the last point, when Quebec passed its bill, Bill 52, just a few months before, it was becoming inevitable, this Dr. Yves Robert, who was one of the architects of the bill, was interviewed by a Post reporter, and he was asked, well, how do you feel? You finally succeeded. His words were something to the effect of, this is great, but it's a start. Once people get used to it, we will expand the ages and we will expand the number of ailments. So right away, when they say right now, and editorial boards bought it, that it's safe, technically speaking, it's true. But when you have the architect of the bill tell you that this is only the beginning, it's not like you have to read behind the lines. There's nothing nuanced there, correct?
Absolutely.
So,
the architects are telling us their plan. The jurisdictions speak for themselves. As far as I'm concerned, God does not need to factor into this whatsoever. It doesn't matter if you're left, right, or center of the spectrum. Wake up. Do your research, because as you said so eloquently, otherwise you are the ones who are approaching it with blind faith. Charles, you have so much to share on this issue. You are a fountain of knowledge. I am so happy for my sake and for our viewers' sake that you joined us today, and I hope we can have you again as this sad story continues to unfold in our country.
Anytime, and I would just like to say, if you are opposed to this, please, please, please send an email to the Justice Minister, CC, the Prime Minister, and your MP. Make it clear why. Doesn't matter. Use personal anecdotes if you want, or just say you're against it for whatever reason, and ask for a reply, and you will get one. If we had a year ago millions of people doing this, I don't think we'd be in the exact same situation. You must, if you are against this, I think you're obligated to do something, and writing a letter by email is not exactly onerous.